بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Today we will be covering the 77th Hikma, the 77th aphorism of the collection of aphorisms by Imam Ibn Atayr al-Sikandi radiyallahu ta'ala anhu wa nafa'ana bi'ulumi fid darain ameen. And this is one of the more difficult aphorisms. It has a very deep meaning and experiential meaning, but we'll still cover it and do the very best we can. And we will mostly just be quoting and trying to translate some of what the great scholars who have internalized this text and realized their meanings have said, and that what they have, how they've explained this aphorism. So no claims are being made, but the hope is that when we know that certain things exist, by knowing that they exist, and it will be a means for us to strive to attain them. And just loving the people of Allah who have attained these realities is a great station in of itself. So this aphorism states, Mal arifu man idha ashara wajada al-haqqa aqraba ilayhi min isharatihi bal al-arifu man la isharata lahu li thana'ihi fi wujudihi wa intiwa'ihi fi shuhudihi. So this could translate, the arif, who is the Gnostic, the knower of Allah, is not one who, when he speaks by way of ishara, allusion, or you could say subtle indication, finds the truth with a capital T, Allah Ta'ala, nearer to him than his illusion. Rather, the Gnostic or knower of Allah is the one who has no illusion due to his annihilation in his existence and absorption in witnessing him. As you can see, this is a very deep aphorism. And so this could be summarized as simply the true knower of Allah. And necessarily this path is one that we oftentimes have to speak about things that might seem out of reach in order to let us know what the path is. And then what's important is that we take a path to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to attain that which He has in store for His very special people. And from the bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah has given us clarity on what that path is, what we need to do every step along the way. And ultimately what we need is to focus on the moment in which we are in. And the sign that we will increase spiritually and ascend spiritually is that we are able to perfect the moment that we're in, the stage that we're in, what we're actually doing. The part of the plot of shaitan is to get us to be preoccupied with something else other than the moment in which we are in, even if it be something that is good. So we might be in prayer thinking about other things that are good in and of themselves, but that's not the time for it. When it's time to learn, it's time to learn. When it's time to remember, it's time to remember. When it's time to serve, it's time to serve. When it's time to speak to someone, you speak to someone. It's time to, you put everything in its proper place. And this is the state of the believer, is that throughout our day, we will be doing a number of different things. The key is that everything we do, and so what the scholars of this side call a talawun, all of the changes and that the ways that we adapt to the moment that we're in. And ultimately, the arif billah, who's he's speaking about here, is someone who responds to the moment that they're in because they see it as being from Allah in the way that is most pleasing to Allah. They live in the moment, these people. And as a result of living in the moment, they are spared much of the angst and difficulty and stress and worry and worldly fear that other people that have to go through because of their state of heart and they're being bereft of these meanings. So the Gnostic is not one who, when he speaks by way of illusion, finds the truth ta'ala nearer to himself than his illusion. Rather, the Gnostic is the one who has no illusion due to his annihilation in his existence and absorption and witnessing him. So let's unpack this. So here the ma is a particle to negate. Mal arifu. The arifu is really the one who knows. But this has a special meaning with the scholars of this science, is that the arif is the Gnostic. This refers to gnosis, and that means experiential knowledge. So there's not just anyone who knows anything. This is someone who has experiential knowledge of Allah, an arif billah, a knower of Allah. And even the way that we say that at arif billah, as we might have pointed out before, the terminology of these great imams is a terminology that de-emphasizes the nafs. So if you say al-arif billah, literally that means a knower through Allah. There's no attribution to yourself at this point. The knower through Allah. And in order to truly come to know Allah, is that we have to depart from our own selves. And if you look at how true spirituality, prophetic spirituality of Islam, were the last recipients of this knowledge, is that even other people try, they don't have what we have. This knowledge leads to closeness and proximity to Allah if we put it into practice. And when someone puts this knowledge into practice, by the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if they're sincere, which is a manifestation of tawfiq, Allah ta'ala will cause them to experience something of these realities to various degrees. So, mal arifun, the arif, the knower of Allah, ma is not man. Here, one who. The knower of Allah is not man, one who. Ida ashara, when he makes an allusion, or when he speaks by way of allusion, ashara. So literally, ashara is to point. So I could say to you, look at the beautiful moon. It's splendid. Or if we're all outside and if I just go like this and everybody looks at where I'm pointing, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm pointing to the beautiful full moon. And when people, this is what's called an ishara. I'm indicating the moon. I didn't say anything. But because I went like this, people knew to look that way. They see the beautiful full moon. And so without me saying anything, my indication pointed to it. Similarly, that this idea of ishara connotes the meaning of speaking in a particular way, where you use words that not everybody understands, but they have a hidden meaning that the people who understand that meaning because they have a similar experience. And so this is why you could also say an ishara is a subtle indication. So it's either an allusion, which means it has a hidden meaning, or it's a subtle indication. It can be translated in one of those ways. But in Arabic, it's al-ishara, ishara. And not in its linguistic or grammatical sense. There's what's called ism al-ishara. Hada wa hadihi wa hadani wa hadi. Those who are studying that Arabic, knows how to memorize those. Ha'ulai wa ma'il dharik. But here it has a spiritual meaning. And you have nahwa al-lisan and you have nahwa al-qulub. You have grammar of the tongue and you have grammar of the heart. Imam al-Qushayri actually has a book called Nahwa al-Qulub al-Kabir, the grammar of the hearts. So Ibn Ahmed ibn Ajiba has a spiritual commentary on the Ajurumiyah, where they point to the various spiritual meanings of grammar, and that all of the various grammatical terms and that meanings that we have in grammar have spiritual meanings as well. And if someone doesn't speak correctly outwardly, then it's good for them to learn. But if someone has a lahan, is that they make a mistake and something's wrong with the grammar of their heart, that has more severe consequences. So, Mal Arifu Man, the Gnostic, is not one who, Ida Ashara, when he speaks by way of allusion, whether that be with an expression that is of prose or whether it be by way of poetry. And one of the reasons that the scholars of this science speak in poetic form is because poetry lends itself to speak about meanings, especially of this nature, more so than prose. Prose is that there's certain things you can say, but those meanings point to other meanings, and those who know them know them. But there's something special about poetry that encapsulates these meanings in ways that prose might not be able to. And this is why many of the great knowers of Allah produced beautiful diwans, collections of poetry. Some of them that very long, some of them multiple volumes, some of them in the hundreds of poems. And it's not considered to be wahi. Wahi is only for the prophets. Prophets receive wahi. But this is one of the closest things to that, is that the people of Allah receive what's called ilham. Ilham. They receive inspiration. And you'd be surprised that sometimes there's people, even in the lands in which we live, that receive these meanings. And when they come to them, they come to the heart in a very particular way. And it's what's called a warid. Inspiration comes to their heart. And it oftentimes takes the form then of poetry and beautiful meanings that they experience that then they put into words. And really they're inspired with those words. And then when they hear those words recited after it, is that it reminds them of those meanings that they experienced. And then for those of us that are novices and beginners and don't know our right hand from our left hand, is that when we hear their beautiful poetry, we sing their beautiful poetry in gatherings. And from the blessing of those hearts that those words emanated from, these words are coated with light and they impact our hearts. And they pull our hearts towards those meanings, even if we're distant in and of ourselves. This is why we recite the poetry of the righteous in our gatherings. And everybody knows when they're recited, even if we don't understand. I, for instance, don't understand Urdu. I only know a few Urdu words, the ones that I learned when I was learning Persian. But there's something about Urdu not. Even if you don't understand it, it just touches the heart. And the same is for that Persian poetry and other, that beautiful, that forms of poetry in other languages. In Arabic is no different. And so when they're recited in beautiful ways, and then the lahans, the melodies, also play their part, these things help us. They help us. And so the knower of Allah is not the one who, when he speaks by way of allusion, and so it gets a little bit more difficult. وَجَدَ الْحَقَّ أَقْرَبَ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ إِشَارَتِهِ, finds the truth, al-haq, ta'ala, who refers to our Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَقْرَبَ إِلَيْهِ, nearer to himself, min isharatihi, that nearer to himself than his illusion. So he's saying that this is not the arif who has this experience, that when that he speaks in this particular way, by way of ishara, by way of subtle indication, that he finds the truth subhanahu wa ta'ala nearer to himself than what that subtle indication was pointing to. Bal al-arif, rather the knower of Allah, man la isharata lah, man is the one who, and then la isharata, this is negating, there has no illusion, is the one who has no illusion. So when I say illusion, I'm saying illusion with an A, not illusion with an I. Has no illusion. Why? Li, due to fana'ihi. Fana is usually translates annihilation. Li fana'ihi fi wujudihi. Due to his annihilation in his, with a capital H, existence. Wow. So that we can reach a state of what's called fana, where we are completely annihilated in the existence of Allah. And that doesn't mean that we have union with God and that we don't believe that God is the spirit of the universe. God is the originator of the universe. It's not like our spirit is meaning this. We don't speak like that. We're very precise when we speak about this language. And that's impossible for us to attain union, ittihad or halul with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's kufr to believe that. So when we talk about thana, annihilation here in his existence, is that we are becoming annihilated in his remembrance. He is the only one that we remember. He is the only one that we witness. And so, لِفَنَائِهِ, so fana is annihilation. فِي وُجُودِهِ, in his existence. And this is possible where someone becomes so preoccupied with the remembrance of Allah that they forget that they actually exist. But this is a state. This is not something you can just say, okay, I'm going to turn on the switch of fana in my heart. Fana. And then it doesn't work like that. You have to work towards this. And then Allah makes this happen to you. And then to clarify this further, is that وَانْتِوَاءِهِ فِي شُهُودِهِ. Intiwa is from tawa yatwi, which is to fold something. So intawa is to be folded up, literally. But here, we're translating as absorption. So, لِفَنَائِهِ فِي وُجُودِهِ, due to his annihilation in his existence, وَانْتِوَاءِهِ فِي شُهُودِهِ, in his absorption in witnessing him. These are very lofty meanings. Now, it's important to note that this state that is being described here was the state of many of the companions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Someone might ask, this language that you're referring to, thana and arif and this type of thing, what is he talking? This is bid'ah. This is an innovation. Where are these terms coming from? Is that one of the first great imams to use technical terms was the great imam, Sayyid al-Ta'ifa, Imam Junayd al-Baghdadi. And at a certain juncture, through a divine wisdom, there came a time where the ulama felt a need to articulate these realities and assign technical terms to them. But these are words that are being used to point to realities. And those realities existed most perfectly in the prophets, and the top of the list, and the imam of them was our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And no generation experienced them more than Sadat and the Sahaba, than the great companions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the one who looks very closely at the words of the Sahaba will start to see glimpses of these meanings. But they weren't articulated during their time. They were experiencing their realities, but they weren't articulated until a few hundred years later. And then those meanings were passed down from chest to chest, from heart to heart, with the oral transmission which precedes the written transmission. And this is how the tabi'in were as well, and the tabi'in, as a result of the barakah of that transmission. So, for example, when you have a statement, for instance, like Sayyidina Mu'adh, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, the great chieftain from the Ansar, when he says, from the time that I became Muslim, never was my heart not present with Allah. Ajib. He became Muslim and his heart is with Allah. Jalla Jalaluhu. Ajib. What kind of state is that to be in? Right? As if they, again, it's like a switch. You can just know this is what happened to them when they came in the presence of Rasulullah. That were we only to know what it's like to be in Rasulillah's presence, Ya Allah. For those that saw him, they looked at him, but they saw him. And there's some people who look at him, but they don't see him. And that still remains today, where people hear this type of language, but they don't get it. At very least, don't make inkar. Don't deny that these are truths, at very least. And then better yet, just believe in the people of Allah. It's what Imam al-Junayd calls the wilayat al-sughra, the lesser sainthood. At-tasdiq bi amrina hada al-wilayat al-sughra. Just believe in an affair of ours is the lesser sainthood. The greater sainthood is to experience the meanings. But if we make inkar of them and think that that's as bid'ah, let alone shirk, innovation, or some type of form of disbelief, is that we'll be veiled from these meanings big time. And that's not, we don't want that to happen. And so when you understand them and then you look at the hadith of our Prophet, then you'll wonder why some of those who much, much later in recent times preoccupy themselves with hadith seem to criticize especially the hadith that have any esoteric meaning. SubhanAllah. As if that there's any esoteric meaning, we got to find some problem with the hadith. As if that our deen doesn't have a spiritual component to it, an inner component to it, an esoteric component to it. Ultimately, we have them all a balance. And there's a hadith in Sahih Muslim, just by way of example. It's in Sahih Muslim, where Ubay ibn Ka'b came to the Prophet ﷺ after hearing that a man or two that recite Quran and learn a recitation different than the one that he had learned, really a mode of reading. And he said, that's not the way I learned it. And he felt that it was wrong. So he took him to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ had him recite, and then had him recite. And then the Prophet said that both of their recitations were correct. And then Ubay ibn Ka'b said that doubt entered into my heart as if it was from the time of Jahiliyyah. And then the Prophet ﷺ, then Ubay says, so when the Prophet ﷺ saw ma ghashiyani, what overtook me, he said that darabani fi sadri, the Prophet ﷺ took his blessed hand and struck me on the heart. Fafidtu araqan. And so then I started to profusely sweat. He said, then he says, فَكَأَنِّي أَنْظُرْ إِلَى اللَّهِ كَفَرَكَ السُّرْعَةِ. وَكَمَا قَالَ صلى الله عليه وسلم. And then it was as if that I was gazing upon Allah clear as daybreak. See? What transpired in that moment where before the Prophet ﷺ touched him, it wasn't like that. As soon as his blessed hand hit his heart, the veil was lifted. Our Prophet himself, he wouldn't have said in his definition, we've mentioned this before, in ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tara, if it wasn't possible to see Allah by way of divine witnessing with the eye of the heart, he wouldn't have defined ihsan as that. And how else are you going to translate that? And ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tara. To worship Allah as if you see him. That's mushahada. If that wasn't possible, he wouldn't have said that. And do you think he's going to speak about a meaning that he hasn't experienced? He is the Imam. He is the Imam of every hadra. Any knowledge of Allah that anyone's ever experienced, including the prophets, it was only through the blessing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what happened to the companions? And unfortunately, people lose this aspect. But when you know this knowledge, even if it's at the level of ilm, and then you read the stories of the Sahaba, they take on a different meaning. Then you start to see, oh, that indicates this. Oh, that indicates the, it starts to make sense. And then at a certain juncture in history, is that you had ulama like Imam al-Junayd speak about these meanings and articulate them. And talk about these different states of qabd and of bast, and of that constriction and of expansion. Words like fana and words of this nature, is that they assigned technical meanings to them, pointing to these realities. And then this is what the Sufiya took upon themselves throughout the centuries, are the people who took upon themselves the desire to come to know Allah and become an arif billah. is that that reality existed in the time of the companions. The companions wanted to know Allah. That وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُم بِالْغَدَاةِ وَيُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ. Be patient with those who are calling upon their Lord in the morning and evening. They desire their Lord. يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ. They want His countenance. And so, other verses like قُلِ اللَّهِ, say Allah. ثُمَّ ذَرْهُمْ فِي قَوْلِهِمْ يَلْعَبُونَ. And then leave them to just that play in whatever it is that they're delving into. So this is important to note when we talk about this, that this is far from being an innovation. This is from the essence of what it means to be from Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah and a true that follower of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. This is the real aspect of our deen that you and I want to attach our hearts to, and from the bounty of Allah, the great mashayikh are still there. Even though they might not be fully represented the way they should be by their students, which is oftentimes the case, but the true mashayikh are still there. And all of the ranks of wilayah, all of the ranks of sainthood are still there. And the great mashayikh are the doors to these meanings. Just as the Prophet was the door to the companions, the great shuyukh throughout the centuries are the doors to fully following the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And this is one of the ways that you could explain essentially the science of tasawwuf, is that how to follow the kitab and the sunnah in the most elevated and specific way. That's one of the meanings. That's what really tasawwuf is. It's nothing other than following the kitab and the sunnah. But it's not just following it in a general way. It's following it in a very specific way, in the most perfect of ways. That's exactly what tasawwuf teaches you, is how to actualize your iman and your Islam by moving up in the degrees of ihsan. So let's look at a few meanings here of this aphorism. So let's first talk about an ishara. Sayyidi Ahmed ibn Ajib tells us, he introduces three terms: ishara and ibara and ramz. An ibara is just a phrase, like an outward expression. An ishara is a subtle indication. And then a ramz is a symbol. And so that an ishara is more subtle than an ibara. Something that you explicitly state. If something's subtly indicated, it's more subtle. And that a symbol then is even more subtle than the illusion, the ishara. And what he says here is that when you speak plainly with plain expressions and plain speech, this clarifies the reality that someone is speaking about. And then the illusion is that points to those meanings. And then at the most subtle level of the symbol is that this leads to an experience. That symbol, for those who understand them, leads to an experience of the heart. And so some have said about this science, i.e. the science of tasawwuf, ilman kullu ishara. It really is that a science of subtle indications. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a fard ayn individual obligation component to it. There is. Things that are very clear and very simple to understand. Is that this is what you do. It's about taqwa. This is where you start. It's about tawbah. This is how you start. Then you define what that means, putting Allah's commandments into practice outwardly and so forth. Then there's certain attributes of the heart that you have to acquire. There's diseased heart you have to rid yourself of, and there's an outward dimension of it. But when we talk about the fruits of this science, is that this is what is meant here. And what they say here, فَإِذَا صَارَ عِبَارَ خَفِيَةً. So when this science becomes something that is only spoken about, then it's not fully comprehended. Right? It could be lost. And this is why, for the most part, and this is one of the practical meanings of this, is that it's very easy to speak about things. It's very easy to talk about things. But what we ultimately want is not to be limited to what we want to experience the reality of what we are saying, of what it is that we know we should know. We don't just want to talk about it. And the thing is that you could have someone who's very eloquent in tongue and sit here and talk from now until next week about this topic. And the vast majority of people, there might be a little bit of benefit, but the vast majority of people, it's not going to benefit. And then you could have someone who speaks very little, speaks maybe uneloquently. But this most simple of things that they say touch your heart like none else. And they used to say, scholars of the science, "Man lam yanfa'ka lahdahu, lam yanfa'ka lafdahu." Is that anyone that you sit before, that by looking at them, i.e. being in their presence, if that doesn't benefit you, what they say is not truly going to benefit you. And they're great shuyukh like Habib Umar bin Ahmed bin Sumait, who was buried in the Comoros Islands off the coast of East Africa. He used to speak very little. And when students would read with him, he would almost never comment on them reading. He would just listen. But the students, when they would read, they would understand. And this is real. And those that study with Marabat al-Hajj, rahimahullah, know this. When you study with him, he would only give the most simple of explanations. But from the barakah of his presence, the knowledge would just expand from the barakah of reading it with him. And this is how the true people of Allah are. This science is more a science of realization. But keep in mind, as we move closer and closer to the end of time, Muslims will be many in number, but the problem will be lack of quality. So if we talk about quality of a believer, it doesn't mean that we judge people, but this is just understanding the time in which we live. Is that what determines our quality is our degree of ihsan ultimately. The higher the degree of ihsan, the more we move up into degrees of experiential faith, and then leads to being present with Allah while we practice outwardly. And we move up in the degrees of the science of ihsan, getting closer and closer to the highest degree of divine witnessing, moving up in those degrees, the more quality of a believer that we become. And the heavier in the scales we will be. This is why they mention about some of these great imams, right? They mentioned this about Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq, where his iman to be placed on one side of the scale and the iman of the entire ummah on the other side of the scale, that it would outweigh it. And they mentioned about some of the great arifin billah, that were they to be placed on one side of the scale, and many of the other families, they would have outweighed them because of their spiritual meaning. And the spiritual meanings are heavy. Allah says, "Sunulqi alayka qawlan thaqila." We're going to cast upon you a heavy word. Spiritual meanings are heavy. And one time, one of the great imams, Imam Bakr al-Sukran, his father told someone to try to pick him up, and he was only a young boy, like 4 or 5 years old, and they couldn't pick him up because of the spiritual weight he was bearing at that young age, and he was still a child. So spiritual weight is very heavy. And sometimes it physically impacts the people. And it's from here that the scholars always wanted to make sure that they were physically healthy and were physically strong. Because the more physical strength that you have when the spiritual weight comes, the more you'll be able to bear. And likewise, the more outward knowledge you have, the more spiritual weight that comes on your shoulders, the more you'll be able to bear it. And that's ultimately what is that perfect balance between the outward and the inward. So, is that this science by nature, when someone's experiencing it and then articulating it, is that it tends to be by way of ishara. And so then Sidi Ahmed Abjid goes on to say is that the ishara of the Sufiya, when they speak in this way, the people of Tasawwuf, it's hiya taghazzalatuhum. A taghazzul is love poetry about the ones that they love. This is one of the great themes of spiritual poetry. You see an emphasis on love, where they talk about all these different ways in which they refer to their beloved. And you'll hear them talk about all different types of things, where they'll talk about things like khamar. And a'udhu billah, they don't mean wine the way that we normally think about it, or any type of alcohol. No, you'll hear this, right? And that what they mean is that intoxicated state that comes to their heart from light striking it. That's what they mean. So when they talk about khamr, they're not a'udhu billah, right, talking about wine. They're talking about something that they experience. When they talk about their kisan, right, sukina kisan, that's given to drink from cups. They're not talking about cups that outwardly you put in it some haram substance. They're talking about spiritual cups that they are drinking from. The cups of muhabba. They said about Sayyidina Faqih Muqaddam, one of the great imams, the great imam of the Ba'alawi, that someone saw him in a dream. And it was said about him that from the time that he was created, he was drinking from the cup of love, and he's yet to have that quenched his thirst. What does it mean to drink from the cup of love? So then this is where we talk about ishara. وَسَقَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ شَرَابًا طَهُورًا. سَقَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ. Who gave them to drink? Their Lord gave them to drink from a purifying drink. سَقَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ. So there are some people, the only thing they're going to understand from that is the physical bliss of paradise of drinking something is good. But then there's other people who understand other meanings from that. وَسَقَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ شَرَابًا طَهُورًا. So they speak about their Nadim. The Nadim literally is the boon companion, the one that stay up at night with. They speak of samar and musamara, right? Staying up at night. وَهَكَذَا. Because in the dunya, this is when people that like each other or love each other, they spend time with them, usually oftentimes at night. But these people, their nights are different. And they talk about that these nights of wasl, and that wasl is arrival, or that wasl here really means is that, like within the ones that we describe, Udi ya layal al-ridha, return, O nights of contentment. Return, O nights of contentment. And you'll see these themes throughout the poetry that they recite. And for us, we're like parrots, we're saying it outwardly. But if the least that we get is we love them, khalas yakfi. It's enough. Even if we don't experience anything and no one's making any claim, we don't know anything about their science. We're juhad. We're ignorant. At least I'm speaking for myself. But we love them. And we believe in them. And we believe in what they experience, that this is the greatest thing that human beings can experience. The sweetness of Iman and all of the different forms it takes, and these things that they're mentioning. Names of individuals, wine, cups, boon companions, things of this nature, or even speaking about the stars and the moon and suns and so forth and so on, and lightning flashes and all these other types of things. These are all isharat. They point to spiritual meanings that they are tasting. And so what this aphorism really means is that the arif, the knower of Allah, who's kamil, who reaches the higher degrees of perfection, who is haqiqi, the real true one, and the one who really knows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is not the one when he indicates something of the asrar of tawheed, the secrets of belief in the divine unity, is that he then finds the truth ta'ala nearer to him than his illusion. Because what does he say here? And this gets very subtle. لِأَنَّهُ حِينَئِذٍ يَكُونُ بَاقِعًا مَعَ نَفْسِهِ. In this state, He will remain with his self. وَمُلَاحِظًا أَنَّ هُنَاكَ إِشَارَةً وَمُشِيرًا, indicating that there still is an ishara, a subtle indication, and someone who's indicating فَهُوَ مَعَ الْأَغْيَارِ, he is with that other, those things that are other than Allah. Very subtle meaning. So this is who he's speaking to. Ibn Atiyah is speaking to this person, is that he wants to point them to the higher degree, is that there's a higher degree of ma'rifah where someone becomes a true knower of Allah, is that la ishara lahu aslan. He doesn't have any of these subtle indications to begin with. Why? Because he is completely annihilated in the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in his existence, tabaraka wa ta'ala. And he's completely absorbed in witnessing him. So this is not a person who then needs to even use any of these things to point to those realities. And then the ones that are so firmly grounded that have been given the duty of calling people to Allah, then that they might be permitted to speak about certain things to bring people closer. And is it for this reason, is that Imam Haddad one time asked one of his students, how many degrees of da'wah are there? And his student said, Allah wa rasuluhu anta a'lam. Allah and his messenger, you know best. And he said without hesitation, maratib da'wati khams. There are 5 degrees of da'wah. And he said, calling the believers to the sharia with the tongue of the sharia, literally, the language of the sharia. Calling the believers to the sacred law through the sacred law. Number 2, he said, calling to the people who are following the sacred law to the tariqah with the language or tongue of the tariqah, the spiritual path. Then the 3rd level, calling to the people who are treading the spiritual path to experiencing the haqiqah with the tongue of the haqiqah. And then the 4th and 5th, it just will translate what he said, is that calling to the people who are experiencing spiritualities to the truth, al-haq, with the lisan al-haq, with the tongue of truth. And then the 5th and highest is calling people who are experiencing lisan al-haq, whatever that means, the tongue of truth, to a higher degree of experience of the haq, with the lisan al-haq. That's the highest. And then some are calling all people in one gathering, depending upon where they are, to what's higher. And if there's great inheritors of the Prophet ﷺ doing that, what about Rasulullah? Everybody would get everything that they needed from the Prophet ﷺ. He says one thing and everyone benefits where they are, and it takes them higher. Because he was given Jawami al-Kalim, comprehensive words, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And then his inheritors have inherited, in a relative way, Jawami al-Kalim, comprehensive words. And subhanAllah, the true waratha, the true inheritors, they say everyone attend the same gathering, but then when you hear, what did you understand from that? What did you understand from that? What people understand oftentimes is different from the nur, from the light of what it is that they are saying. So this is essentially what he is saying, is that the knower of Allah is not the one who, when he speaks by way of illusion, finds the truth ta'ala nearer to himself than his illusion. Rather, the Nastir or knower is the one who has no illusion due to his annihilation in his existence and absorption and witnessing him. So it's as if that he is calling us to this highest of states, and that there's something higher than pointing to certain things, and then that higher than remaining with ourselves, still noticing ourselves, that we want to reach a state where the ego becomes so neutralized and you become so detached from it that you completely forget it. Look at the difference between our world in which we live and what we're being called to, and the Western world and everything that's being imported to the rest of the world in between this meaning. is that here you have the highest manifestation of making the ego central, of perfect egocentrism. What we're saying is the spiritual path, the highest degree of the spiritual path is where you completely forget your ego and you have zero ego and you're totally absorbed in the remembrance of Allah and you no longer have a nafs. That's the goal of the spiritual path. And then these things strengthen your iman. Why? Because you look around and choose. Do you want to be these people who for them the ego is at the center? Or do you want to be like these people where that they've annihilated themselves in the remembrance of Allah? Someone can then choose. And the closer and closer we get to the end of time, the more polarized things are going to become, leading to people that are like this fully with no hypocrisy whatsoever, the people who have nothing but this. And these people over here will be from the awliya of Shaitan and be in his hierarchy and be a minion to serve his plot on earth. And these people over here will be from the awliya of Ar-Rahman and have a direct connection to the Rasul ﷺ and his inheritors and be a means for the fulfillment, for the divine will to be implemented here in this earth. It's not even a choice. We know exactly where we need to be, where we should be, and which people that we should hold and cling onto. May Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala give us tawfiq and bless us in all of our affairs. Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. May Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala bless us too, that become absorbed fully in the meanings of His remembrance, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen, and to attain these lofty degrees that they are describing, Ya Allah, not because of anything that we have done or anything that we could ever do, but solely from His generosity and His mercy. May Allah Ta'ala bless our hearts to incline towards these meanings and to do everything that we can in the moment to move towards them. May Allah Ta'ala make our feet firm and strengthen our iman and bless us to reach the higher degrees of practice and ultimately reach the highest degree of ihsan bi mahdi judihi wa fadlihi subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.